He needed a wife, and it wasn't out of some fleeting fancy. It was because his entire life seemed to ache for a presence, for a voice inside the house, for laughter over the morning coffee. But every time a young woman agreed to see the place where he lived, the exact same thing happened. They would look around, their chests would tighten, and they would weep without even trying to hide it. Can you imagine what it is like to be a decent, hard-working man and still have to watch someone's face crumble into tears simply because of your roof, your floors, your world? This happened in July of 1911, deep in the Texas plains, on a stretch of hard-packed dirt road that the folks of Stony Ridge crossed with a whispered prayer when the evening shadows fell a little too early. And before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and which town holds your heart, because the best stories are the ones that feel like they happened right in our own backyards. The farm was called Hidden Springs, though it held far more promise of springs than actual abundance. It was an old name, the kind born from idle chatter leaning against a fence line, when someone points to the dust and says that down there, deep underneath, some hidden water must surely run. Up on the surface, all that existed was the harsh, unforgiving prairie, sparse buffalo grass in some spots, patches of exposed red dirt in others, and a wind that whistled a different, lonelier tune when it blew through the twisted fence posts. Henry Carter's cabin sat on a modest rise, built there more out of sheer stubbornness than choice. He had raised the rough-hewn timber walls with his own hands, packing the cracks with mud and straw, and covered it with weathered shingles bought on credit at the Stony Ridge General Store. It was a tiny place, just 2 rooms, with a narrow front porch that offered no shelter from a driving sideways rain, and during the dry spells, caught dust like a sieve. The front yard was nothing but beaten earth, no flowers, no shade from a fruit tree, just a crooked hitching post where he tied his horse, and a wooden wash basin leaning against the wall, always holding a meager leftover splash of water for the hottest days. Henry was 34 years old and possessed the demeanor of a man who seemed to have been born already exhausted. He wasn't a handsome man, no. But anyone who looked closely saw the strong face, the broad forehead, the straight nose, and a jawline rock hard from grinding his teeth on the inside. Yet there was a profound quietness about him that kept people at arm's length. He spoke very little, not out of ignorance, but out of an economy of the soul. He had learned early on that an excess of words doesn't fill a stew pot or mend a broken fence. The townsfolk respected Henry because he always paid his debts, never stirred up trouble, and never denied a favor if it was within his power to give. But respect is not a warm embrace, and his heart already ached for a kind of warmth that didn't come from a kerosene lantern or a cast-iron wood stove. The loneliness at Hidden Springs didn't just begin in 1911. It had been dragging on since the year Henry buried his parents a while back, when he was still mostly a boy. There was no public drama in the town square, no exhibition of grief. His mother passed during a bitter season. His father followed her a few months later, leaving him with the inheritance of a plot of land that wasn't very large and a house that was next to nothing. What he did was carry on. And carrying on, sometimes, is a form of quiet courage that never gets an audience's applause. He spent his days in a harsh, simple routine. He woke before the light was truly light, when the sky was still a bruised grey, and the pre-dawn chill clung to his skin like a damp cloth. The smell of weak coffee would rise, mingling with the smoke of green firewood. The rhythmic sound of grinding coffee beans by hand kept his thoughts company, followed by the clink of iron on leather, the creak of the saddle, the impatient snorting of his horse, and the world opening up before him in endless stretches of road, brush, wire, and labor. He kept a small herd of cattle, just enough to keep the farm breathing rather than to build a fortune. There was a stubborn patch of corn and beans that resisted the elements just like he did, and a distant creek that, in the dry season, shriveled into a sad trickle of water, forcing Henry to carry heavy buckets back and forth, the wire handles cutting into his palms and his arms, trembling from the sheer effort. When the late afternoon sun dipped low, he would return with his shirt plastered to his back, salt and dust caked into his sweat. He would wash his face in an enamel basin, the shockingly cold water waking up his skin, and sit on the porch with a simple plate of food. The silence of the place carried a heavy physical weight. It was as if the entire farm held its breath when the day finally ended. Sometimes he would hear an animal out in the brush, a dry snap of a twig, the call of a bird that sounded like a warning. Other times, absolutely nothing. Nothing except his own solitude, which made a deafening noise on the inside. That was exactly why Esther, Henry's older sister, decided to meddle. Esther lived in Stony Ridge, married to a decent man who made a living doing small hauling jobs and repairing harnesses. She was the kind of woman who spoke while looking you dead in the eye, who swept the floor while she talked, and who had absolutely zero patience for prolonged melancholy. She was 42, with firm hands, hair permanently pinned back, and a deep well of worry inside that she masked behind clipped sentences and affectionate scolding. One Sunday morning, right after church service, Esther found her brother leaning against the trunk of the oldest oak tree in the town square, watching time pass as if time were a wild bronco he had no idea how to tame. Henry was wearing his cleanest clothes, but even so, he looked entirely out of place among the socializing townsfolk. Esther marched right up to him, smoothed her skirt, and asked point-blank if he truly intended to end his days talking to the walls. Henry let out a short breath through his nose, a half-smile of a man who didn't want to fight, and replied that he wasn't talking to any walls. Esther wasn't having it. She told him he needed a wife. She said there was no shame in craving companionship. She said a house without a woman's voice turns into a haunted place, not haunted by ghosts to pray against, but haunted by a crushing sadness. Henry didn't argue. He just stared out at the dirt road that led out of town and vanished into the dusty horizon, as if somewhere out there lived an answer he simply didn't possess. Esther interpreted her brother's silence as pure consent. That was her way. Once she made up her mind about something, the wheels were already in motion. Her first attempts were somewhat discreet. Esther chatted with a mother here, an aunt there, explaining that Henry was an honorable man, a hard worker, a property owner, and that any young woman who agreed to marry him wouldn't suffer a husband with a drinking habit, a gambling vice, or a heavy hand. She spoke with the unwavering firmness of someone selling the gospel truth. The problem is that the truth always has two faces. Henry was honorable, yes, hardworking, yes. But Hidden Springs was terribly isolated. The cabin was tiny, and its reputation as a mournful place had been circulating for quite some time. Even so, one early afternoon, a young woman named Alice agreed to go take a look. Alice was 21, with the rosy cheeks of someone whose dreams still came easily, and the watchful eyes of someone who had already learned to measure life with a degree of caution. She arrived accompanied by her cousin, their modest buggy stopping at the start of the trail. From there on, the path was too narrow. They rode up on horseback, climbing the gentle slope to the rise where the cabin came into view. Henry was waiting on the porch, his hat in his hands, his shirt buttoned all the way up to his collar. He had swept the dirt yard, filled the earthenware jug with fresh, cool water, and scrubbed the wooden bench clean. He had even set aside a piece of hard molasses candy, wrapped in a clean cloth, like a man offering the absolute best he had to give. When Alice arrived, her horse stopped just shy of the crooked hitching post, as if the animal itself sensed something strange about the place. She dismounted slowly, looked around, and the very first sign was the silence. Not a polite, peaceful silence, but a heavy, echoing, empty silence. A dry wind blew past, kicking up red dust in the yard. The cabin, so small, seemed to shrink back from the vastness of the world. Alice took 2 steps forward and looked at the rough timber and mud walls, the simple wooden door, the narrow porch. She looked at the wild, untamed prairie all around, the sheer distance from everything, the sky that just seemed way too big. And then her expression entirely collapsed. She didn't sob loudly. She cried in the way that hurts the most, her eyes welling up suddenly, a single unpermitted tear slipping down her cheek, her hand flying to her mouth as if trying to physically shove the reaction back inside. Her cousin cleared his throat, deeply uncomfortable. Henry felt his own chest seize up. He asked, his voice low and gravelly, if she wanted to come inside. And Alice, trying her best to be kind, stammered that everything was just very different. She said she hadn't imagined it being so far out. She said she needed some time to think. Needing to think quickly turned into needing to leave. Esther tried to press the issue back in town later, claiming the girl had merely been overwhelmed with emotion, that she had a sensitive disposition. But it wasn't that. It was shock. It was the sheer terror of a life that looked exactly like a punishment. And she wasn't the last. Over the following weeks, other young women came out, always with a chaperone. Some came out of idle curiosity, others pressured by their families, others out of pure financial desperation. Esther was highly skilled at arranging encounters that felt like mere coincidences. Henry, for his part, did everything he could to receive them with dignity, even though his dignity was a stark, unadorned thing. One came and wept the moment she saw the simple rope bed in the back room. Another cried when she realized the drinking water had to be hauled from a creek far away. Another shed tears when she heard right at dusk the lonely sound of the wind sweeping through the prairie grass like a ghost whispering forgotten secrets. There was one who didn't even wait to fully dismount her horse. She took one long look and declared that this wasn't living, it was sheer abandonment, and that word, abandonment, stuck to Henry's insides like a prickly pear thorn. He pretended he hadn't heard her. He nodded politely, tipped his hat, and wished her a safe journey back. But later, sitting all alone, he repeated the word in the dark, like a man testing the bitterness of a poison. Abandonment. That was what his life looked like to the rest of the world. Not hard work, not a noble struggle. Abandonment. The townsfolk started to gossip. Down at the general store, between sips of weak coffee and bites of hard biscuit, the men murmured that Henry was a good sort, but his place was just too sorrowful. They said no one could stand that kind of silence. The women, when they spoke of it, lowered their voices as if the topic demanded a certain reverence. Some said the cabin was simply too small to ever raise a family in. Others claimed that Hidden Springs had a dark streak of bad luck permanently glued to it. Not a haunted, ghostly curse, no, just the bad luck of life. Whatever could go wrong out there surely would. Henry heard the whispers, even when folks tried to hide them from him. Not because anyone was intentionally cruel, but because in a small frontier town, the wind carries every secret. One night, after yet another one of these visits ended in quiet tears, Henry returned to the farm and didn't immediately light the kerosene lantern. He just sat there in the pitch black, breathing in the scent of sun-baked earth that still radiated from the ground, listening to a stubborn cricket chirping just outside his door. His mouth tasted like burnt coffee. His hands smelled of oiled leather and rusted iron. He thought to himself that perhaps this was just the way it was meant to be. Perhaps he had absolutely no right to ask for companionship. Perhaps asking for a wife meant asking someone to shoulder a heavy cross that was meant only for him. His pride, which had seemed dormant for years, finally reared its head. He grew angry with Esther for exposing his raw life to the county, and then he grew furious with himself for letting her do it. The very next day, he rode into Stony Ridge and found his sister out front, furiously sweeping her dirt yard. Esther took one look at him and knew from his very first stride that a storm was brewing. Henry spoke quietly, but with iron in his voice. He told her she could stop right now. He said he didn't want any more visitors, not a single one. He said he was embarrassing himself and making a fool out of everyone else in the process. He told her it was far better to die alone than to spend his days watching strangers cry on his own front porch. Esther, instead of apologizing, crossed her arms tight and took a deep, steadying breath like a woman bracing against a gale. She told him he wasn't an embarrassment. She said the only real shame was accepting a miserable life as if it were a judge's sentence. She said he had turned Hidden Springs into a place of relentless labor, but he had never once made it a home. Henry fired back that home was far too pretty a word for that shack. Esther let out a long sigh and with a sudden softening in her eyes said that maybe that was exactly the point. She told him a home isn't born fully built. It has to be made. She said he didn't need a girl who looked at the mud walls and saw misery. He needed a woman who could look at the dirt and see a beginning. The conversation ended without a hug. Henry rode off, a cloud of red dust kicking up behind his horse, and Esther stood there watching him go, her heart squeezing tight, her pride stinging right alongside it. The days bled into one another with no news, and the farm sank back into its familiar silence. But now, for Henry, that silence had an extra shadow, the lingering memory of weeping women. He started avoiding the porch right around sunset, because that porch had become a stage for scenes he never wanted to relive. He started eating his supper inside, huddled near the wood stove, as if trying to hide from his own inescapable fate. And that was when the letter arrived. On a muggy afternoon in August, the mail rider passed through town and handed Esther a simple envelope. Yellowed paper, impeccable cursive handwriting. Esther tore it open right there in the shade of a brick wall, because her curiosity never had any brakes. And as she read the words, a sudden shiver ran down her spine, not out of fear, but a deep, prophetic premonition. The letter had come all the way from Missouri. It wasn't a letter from a wealthy heiress, nor from a family of high standing. It was from a distant godmother, the kind of relative life scatters across the map, and you only remember when times get unimaginably hard. The godmother wrote that there was a woman named Catherine Barnes, 27 years of age, who had recently buried her father and was fiercely determined to start over fresh. She wrote that Catherine was highly capable, that she knew how to tend a crop, how to bake a perfect pan of cornbread, how to sew an invisible patch on a torn shirt, and that she possessed a tranquil, steadfast courage, the kind that never needs to shout. She said Catherine was heading down to Texas because she had heard there was still land and honest work to be found, and because a beloved aunt who had helped raise her had once mentioned Stony Ridge in a long-ago conversation. Esther read and reread the letter like it was a sacred promise. There was one specific line the godmother had penned with profound affection. She wrote that Catherine smiled easily when she saw simple things. Because she had learned long ago how to be deeply grateful for even the smallest blessings, Esther thought of Hidden Springs. She thought of her brother. She thought of the empty, dusty porch. And she decided she wasn't going to just blurt it out to him, because Henry, whenever he felt cornered, would lock up tighter than a rusted bank vault. She needed to open the door gently, without breaking the hinges. She waited for the following Sunday, knowing her brother would come to church out of deep respect for their late parents and sheer force of habit. When he showed up, hat in hand, Esther didn't bring it up right away. She let him sit in her parlor, let him eat a slice of plain pound cake, let him drink his coffee and make small talk about the weather and the cattle. Only then, when the silence between them felt less brittle, did she pull the letter from her apron pocket and slide it across the table. Henry stared at the envelope like it was a rattlesnake ready to strike. Esther quickly assured him it was just a letter. She told him it wasn't another young girl from town, that no one was going to laugh, no one was going to gossip. She said it was someone from far away, someone who didn't carry the heavy folklore of hidden springs in her head. Henry picked up the letter with extreme caution, as if the paper might crumble at his touch. He read it painfully slowly, his eyes tracing the lines with a level of focused attention he didn't even give to the ledger at the general store. When his eyes hit the name Catherine Barnes, he frowned. When he reached the part about the easy smile, he completely stopped breathing. Esther softly asked what he thought. Henry replied, his voice gravelly, that thinking was a highly dangerous business. He said he had no desire to build up hope, just to watch that hope stand on his porch and cry all over again. Esther, summoning a well of patience she rarely used for anything else in life, told him he didn't have to promise a single thing. She said all he had to do was meet her. She told him that if a woman was traveling from that far away, it was because she had a profound story living inside of her. And sometimes the story inside a stranger is the exact puzzle piece that fits the story inside ourselves. Henry didn't say yes, and he didn't say no. But as he carefully folded the envelope and tucked it into the inner pocket of his shirt, right over his heart, he gave her an answer far louder than he realized. Over the next few weeks, while Catherine was still somewhere on the long road south, Esther began laying the groundwork in a way that didn't look like meddling. She casually mentioned to her brother that he ought to fix up the porch roof, since the rainy season would be turning soon. She noted that he really needed to fix the latch on the front door. She told him that keeping a house in order wasn't for the sake of company. It was for the sake of his own soul. Henry grumbled under his breath, but he did it. He fixed the heavy iron latch. He tripped over his own stubborn pride. He whitewashed the interior walls, making the small bedroom infinitely brighter. He swept down the thick spiderwebs from the high corners, not because he was afraid of bugs, but because he suddenly pictured someone looking up at them and assuming he had completely given up on life. And he hadn't given up, he had just grown numb to it. He also did one thing he never breathed a word about to anyone. He walked out to the edge of the front yard, where the red dirt was a little softer, and dug a small, shallow hole. He buried a packet of seeds he had bought at the general store, simple, hardy wildflower seeds, the kind that can survive punishing sun and almost no water. He couldn't even explain to himself why he did it. Perhaps it was his own silent way of telling the universe that there was finally something growing deep inside of him too. When September rolled in, the road began to whisper. A passing freight hauler mentioned he'd seen a woman traveling alone with a small leather valise and a gaze made of steel. An older lady in town reported that a newcomer had politely asked for directions to Stony Ridge and Hidden Springs, with manners that felt like they belonged to a bygone era. When Esther heard this, her heart hammered against her ribs like she was 20 years old again. On the outside, Henry looked exactly the same. On the inside, the weather had radically shifted. He started hearing footsteps on the floorboards that didn't yet exist. He started imagining a soft voice humming in the house while he washed his lonely plate. He started getting furiously angry with his own imagination, as if hoping for something was a fatal weakness. On the day Catherine finally arrived, the sky was a piercing, cruel blue, the kind of cloudless expanse that lets the Texas sun beat down without an ounce of mercy. The wind blew hot, carrying the scent of parched earth and dried sagebrush, making the miles out to Hidden Springs feel twice as long as they actually were. Esther insisted on riding out with her halfway, refusing to let the woman traverse the loneliest stretch of the prairie by herself. They rode side by side on horseback, following the rutted trail that left the town limits and plunged deep into the brush country. The horses' hooves kicked up a fine red dust that coated their skin and clung to their hair. The rhythm was steady, hoofbeats on hard-packed clay, and every now and then a hawk would dive swiftly across the massive sky like a feathered arrow. Catherine rode with the natural grace of someone who had learned how to balance the heavy burdens of life long before she ever learned to sit in a saddle. She was a slender woman, not from illness, but carved lean by miles of road and years of hard labor. Her chestnut hair was pulled back into a simple, practical knot at the nape of her neck, a few stray wisps escaping and sticking to her damp forehead in the heat. Her face was profoundly serious, but not closed off. Her dark eyes took in the vast, imposing landscape with sharp attention, but not a single flicker of fear. She carried a small leather valise tied behind her saddle and a cloth bundle resting on her lap, holding possessions that carried little physical weight but held immense sentimental value. Esther realized immediately that this was not a woman who arrived with her hand out, begging. She arrived with her hands full, ready to offer. She just didn't know what she was offering yet. Along the trail, Esther asked if the journey had been terribly difficult. Catherine replied, her voice steady and smooth, that a difficult journey is only the one you are forced to take against your will. Hers, no matter how grueling the miles had been, was a choice. She said it with a quiet reverence, like a woman praying without folding her hands. Esther gently asked if Catherine had any family left. Catherine paused for a fraction of a second, as if carefully weighing what was proper to share. She replied that she had a father who was no longer of this earth, and a precious memory of him she refused to let fade. She added that she had learned a hard truth. When you lose something massive in your life, you simply have to start building something else to take its place, even if you have to build it agonizingly slowly. Esther felt a sudden, fierce urge to reach out and squeeze the woman's hand, but she held back. Instead, she simply remarked that her brother was a genuinely good man. She said it in a tone that somehow managed to be both an apology and a blood oath at the exact same time. Catherine merely nodded, as if she already knew down to her bones that a truly good man is a rare commodity in this world, but that rarity alone never guarantees a happy ending. When they reached the final stretch of the trail, Esther pointed toward the horizon, to the modest rise where the weathered cabin stood looking incredibly small against the backdrop of the massive Texas sky. She said, "That was it." Catherine fell entirely silent. Her horse naturally slowed its pace, as if the animal could feel the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The hot wind gusted harder, swirling red dust across the path. The scrub brush surrounding them seemed to close in tighter, and the hum of the cicadas grew deafeningly loud, as if the land itself was drawing in a sharp breath. Henry was waiting on the porch, exactly as he had the very first time. Hat clutched in his hands, a clean, buttoned-up shirt. The only difference was that this time he was rigid with tension. His throat felt like sandpaper, and it wasn't just from the blistering heat. It was from the crushing weight of an expectation he was desperately pretending not to harbor. When Catherine reached the crooked hitching post, she dismounted without a hint of rush. There was no nervous cousin hovering nearby, no disapproving father scowling at the property, no fretful mother eyeing the cabin and judging the kitchen. It was just her, Esther, and Henry, and the suffocating silence of hidden springs, which draped itself around them like a heavy wool blanket. Henry took 2 stiff steps forward and tipped his head politely. He told her it was a profound honor to receive her. He spoke her name with extreme care, as if the syllables themselves were made of fragile glass. Catherine replied that she was deeply grateful for the welcome. Her voice was strong, yet soothing, like cool water poured from an earthenware jug. She looked directly into Henry's weathered face and did not look away. Only then did she turn to look at the cabin. And in that exact fraction of a second, time seemed to completely freeze. The cabin was exactly the same sight that had brought so many other girls to tears. Rough, mud-chinked walls, a plain wooden door, a narrow porch, a barren, baked dirt yard. The crushing distance, the deafening silence, the overwhelming vastness of the world juxtaposed against the pitiful smallness of the house. Henry felt his entire body brace for the inevitable, cruel repetition of his destiny. He felt his chest seize up in agonizing anticipation of her tears. Esther literally stopped breathing, as if holding her breath could magically alter the impending disaster. Catherine took 2 deliberate steps into the dirt yard, her dark eyes slowly, purposefully scanning every single detail, like a scholar reading a letter written in invisible ink. She saw the clay jug filled with fresh water. She saw the scrubbed wooden bench. She saw the wooden wash basin leaning neatly against the wall. She saw the swept, hard-packed earth. She saw the wind kicking up the red dust. And she saw, tucked away in the corner, a small patch of recently turned soil where someone had secretly buried something in the dirt. She stopped dead in her tracks. For one agonizing heartbeat, her face was completely unreadable, frozen in absolute seriousness, as if an ancient, cherished memory had violently collided with her present reality. Henry, entirely without realizing it, crushed the brim of his hat in his fists. Esther pressed her hand hard against her chest, bracing for the sobs. And then Catherine Barnes, instead of crumbling into tears, lifted her gaze back to the weathered little house, and she smiled. It wasn't a smile of mockery. It wasn't a smile born of pity. It was a calm, whole, radiant smile, the smile of a woman who steps onto a desolate piece of earth and instantly recognizes the beautiful, undeniable possibility of life. And it was right there, in that exact, miraculous second, that Henry Carter understood, without yet possessing the words to explain it, that this woman hadn't traveled across the country to mourn Hidden Springs. She had come to see the gold that everyone else was blind to. And that realization, all on its own, was the spark that began to change everything. Life after that smile didn't magically transform into a fairy tale overnight. Anyone who has ever scraped a living from the frontier knows that the earth doesn't yield fruit just because you desperately want it to. It yields fruit only when you bleed over it and care for it. And it's the exact same way with the human heart. Their first day together was defined by a polite, awkward choreography. Henry seemed entirely unsure of what to do with his large hands or where to rest his gaze. The mere presence of Catherine inside that tiny cabin shifted the very oxygen in the room, changed how the light fell across the floorboards, and even altered the way the dust settled on the plain furniture. She, on the other hand, moved with a grounded naturalness that completely disarmed him. After Esther finally rode off, leaving behind a bone-crushing hug and an ironclad promise to return on Sunday, silence descended over Hidden Springs once again. But it was a completely different breed of silence. It was no longer hollow and echoing. It was a silence of profound anticipation. Henry showed her to the room that would be hers, the only enclosed bedroom in the cabin. He announced he would sleep out in the main room, in a canvas hammock, slung between 2 heavy iron hooks he had anchored into the wall timbers years ago. Catherine immediately protested, arguing that it was fundamentally unjust to force a hard-working man out of his own bed. But Henry stood firm, using that quiet, gravelly voice of his that brokered absolutely no argument. He told her that a guest under his roof was owed respect, and a woman under his roof was guaranteed protection. It was the very first time Catherine saw, beneath the sun-baked, calloused exterior of a dirt farmer, the deep-seated chivalry that years of grinding poverty had completely failed to erase. A routine slowly took root, the way a person steps tentatively onto unfamiliar ice, testing its strength. Catherine rose early, long before Henry even stirred. When he stumbled into the kitchen, his face still creased with sleep and his shirt only half-buttoned, he would find the coffee already brewing. And it wasn't the bitter, hasty, watered-down swill he usually made. It was brewed with agonizing patience, rich and fragrant, poured piping hot into a spotlessly clean tin mug. And beside it, there was always something waiting, A slice of golden cornbread, a plate of warm johnny cake she somehow conjured from practically nothing, or flaky buttermilk biscuits she baked from the meager rations she had carried in her valise. It was these tiny daily miracles that began to crack Henry's hardened shell. He would sit down, offer a silent nod of profound gratitude, and eat, savoring a flavor he had completely forgotten existed, the taste of being cared for. Midway through one of those mornings, as the sun was already baking the shingle roof, Henry was out repairing a barbed wire fence near the house. Catherine stepped out onto the porch, holding a stiff straw broom. She paused, looked out over the barren, dirt-packed yard, and without uttering a single word, she started sweeping. She wasn't just brushing away loose dirt. She swept with fierce, deliberate strength, carving beautiful sweeping patterns into the earth, organizing the chaos of the dust, clearing away the dead brush the wind had dragged in. Henry froze, his hammer suspended mid-air. He just stared. She swept her way right up to the fence line where he stood. Then she wiped her damp forehead with the back of her wrist and casually remarked, as if commenting on the weather, that the dirt in the yard was actually quite rich, perfect for a fragrant herb garden. She told him that, if he had no objections, she was going to dig a flower bed right beneath the kitchen window. Henry took a long time to find his voice. He finally mumbled that the ground there was like rock, that absolutely nothing ever survived in it. Catherine smiled. That same world-shifting smile that completely unraveled him. She replied softly that the earth only stays hard when no one ever takes the time to speak to it. And that is how the resurrection began. Over the following days, Hidden Springs watched a garden spring to life. Catherine ruthlessly turned the compacted red dirt. She marched out to the corral to gather manure, a sight that made Henry's eyes widen in shock, seeing a woman of such grace hauling buckets of foul muck, mixed it deep into the soil, and watered it painstakingly by hand from the wash basin. She planted wild onions, cilantro, and fragrant mint, and right in the center she scattered seeds for a tiny, vibrant yellow wildflower she had discovered out in the brush, declaring that beauty was just as essential to survival as food. Henry watched this entire process with a dizzying mix of absolute fascination and paralyzing terror. He was terrified of getting used to it, terrified of allowing himself to believe it would actually last, because his entire life had been defined by catastrophic loss, and a man who loses too much learns early on never to grip anything too tightly. But Catherine was not the kind of woman who walked away. She began to transform the inside of the cabin too. She repositioned the heavy wooden table, draped it with a beautifully embroidered cloth she had stitched herself, and scrubbed the grime-caked windows until the glass sparkled, allowing the Texas sun to pour inside without apology. The cabin, which had always felt like a dark, mournful cave, was suddenly flooded with light. It breathed with life, and Henry, entirely without realizing it, began to transform right alongside it. He lingered longer at the wash basin after a grueling day's work. He started shaving his heavy beard during the week, not just saving it for Sunday mornings. He quietly went to work fixing the broken things he had ignored for years. The whining iron hinges on the front door, the rotting step on the porch, the loose shingle that let the rain drip in. He did all of this in comfortable silence, while she sat nearby, sewing or stirring a pot, their eyes occasionally meeting across the room. They were quick, intensely shy glances, but they carried the weight of a profound conversation their mouths hadn't yet learned how to have. Late one afternoon, he rode back from the far pastures, holding something carefully concealed in his calloused hand. He walked straight into the kitchen, where Catherine was stirring a pot of bubbling peach preserves in an old copper kettle, and gently placed a handful of dark, wildly sweet wild plums on the table, cradled in a broad green leaf. He muttered, staring firmly at his boots, that he had stumbled across the bush down by the far creek bed. He said they were sweeter than honey. Catherine picked up one of the dark, ripe plums, placed it in her mouth, and closed her eyes as the sweet juice burst on her tongue. Then she opened her eyes, looked directly into his soul, and told him it was the absolute sweetest gift anyone had ever given her. Henry felt his weathered face burn red-hot. He bolted from the kitchen, muttering an excuse about needing to brush down his horse, but his heart was hammering against his ribs, wild and entirely out of rhythm, like a giddy schoolboy at a town dance. Time marched on and tipped into October. The autumn storms finally arrived, unleashing torrents of rain that washed the dusty prairie clean, filling the air with that intoxicating, deeply earthy scent of wet soil that goes straight to a person's head. And along with the storms came their very first trial. Deep in the night, a violent thunderstorm shattered the peace over Hidden Springs. Thunderclaps hit so hard they literally shook the floorboards. Jagged forks of lightning ripped the sky wide open, illuminating the dark cabin as bright as noon. The wind howled like a wounded animal, throwing its weight against the glass windows, desperate to break inside. In the back bedroom, Catherine was terrified. It wasn't the fragile fear of a weak woman. It was the primal human terror of someone realizing how terrifyingly small they are against the wrath of the open world. She curled into a tight ball on the bed, pulling the heavy quilt completely over her head. Out in the main room, Henry heard her. He didn't hear crying, but he heard her frightened, trembling silence. He swung his legs out of the hammock, struck a match to light the kerosene lantern, and walked quietly to the closed bedroom door. He knocked gently on the wood. He asked, his voice low, if she was all right in there. Her voice came back muffled through the door, assuring him she was fine, that the noise was just startling. Henry leaned his broad forehead against the wooden doorframe. He spoke with an unwavering, ironclad certainty, telling her that the house was strong. He told her he had built those timber walls with the thickest mud he could find, and that the shingle roof would hold fast against anything the sky threw at it. He swore to her that as long as he drew breath on the other side of that door, nothing bad would ever get inside. A heavy silence fell over the bedroom. Then Catherine's voice returned, noticeably calmer, thanking him softly. He didn't open the door. He simply slid down the wall and sat right there on the floorboards, his back pressed against the wood, standing guard over her sleep while the heavens unleashed fury outside. And it was right there, sitting in the dark, that Henry knew. He knew he no longer wanted to just be the man who owned the deed to the cabin. He desperately wanted to be the man who guarded this woman's peace for the rest of his natural life. But the hard-won peace at Hidden Springs came with an expiration date. A week later, on a blindingly clear morning, a rider appeared on the dirt trail. It wasn't a friendly, neighborly visit. It was Arthur Sterling. Henry was out by the corral, milking a restless cow, when he spotted the purebred stallion, the gleaming silver tack, and the man dressed in an expensive, perfectly tailored riding suit. Arthur was the undisputed king of the county. He owned the richest, flattest, most fertile acreage around, blessed with a year-round river. But men like Arthur always wanted more. He wanted Hidden Springs. Arthur swung down from his saddle with the arrogant ease of a man who believes he owns whatever dirt his boots touch. He greeted Henry with a broad, expansive smile, the kind that shows plenty of white teeth but never quite reaches the eyes. He casually inquired how the farm was doing, throwing out a thinly veiled, mocking compliment about Henry's scrawny cattle, before turning his sharp gaze toward the cabin. He noticed the crisp, clean curtains hanging in the windows. He noticed the vibrant, blossoming flower bed. He noticed the cheerful curl of smoke rising from the chimney. His brow furrowed deeply. He asked if Henry had finally taken in a tenant farmer to help carry the load. Henry, slowly wiping his hands clean on a rag, replied coldly that he hadn't. He stated simply that he had a guest. At that exact moment, Catherine stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing a simple pale cotton dress, her hair swept up in a loose, practical knot, balancing a woven basket of clean laundry against her hip. The second she spotted the stranger, she froze. Arthur turned and stared at her, and the nature of his gaze instantly shifted. It wasn't a look of filthy, base lust. It was the calculating glare of an appraiser valuing a diamond. He saw her striking natural beauty. He saw the aristocratic, unbending posture of her spine, and he realized instantly that this was a woman who did not belong behind mud-chinked timber walls. He swept his expensive hat off his head, offering an exaggerated theatrical bow, and declared smoothly that he had no idea Hidden Springs was harboring such an exquisite, rare flower. Catherine's face remained utterly stony. She offered a single, curt nod of acknowledgement and immediately turned on her heel, vanishing back inside the house. Arthur turned his attention back to Henry. His smile now held the bitter tang of poison. He stated that he had ridden out to put his offer back on the table. He reminded Henry that he was willing to pay top dollar for the barren dirt. He smoothly suggested that Henry could finally take the cash, move to a civilized town, live like a real human being, and buy a proper house made of actual brick. Henry gave him the exact same answer he always did. The land was not for sale. Arthur chuckled, a low, condescending sound. He took a deliberate step closer, invading Henry's space, and dropped his voice to a conspiratorial murmur. He claimed he deeply admired Henry's stubborn streak, but he urged him to be a realist. He pointed out that now, with a female companion under his roof, his financial responsibilities had exponentially increased. He leaned in and whispered that beautiful women grow very tired of living in grinding poverty. He said women crave comfort, they crave security, and he sneered that Hidden Springs, especially with the brutal drought that everyone knew was coming, would never provide her with anything but endless misery and red dust. Henry felt the blood roar in his ears, boiling hot, but he clamped his jaw shut and kept his fury leashed. He simply told Arthur to get off his property. The wealthy rancher swung effortlessly back onto his prize stallion. Before spurring the horse away, he cast one long, deliberate look at the window where Catherine had disappeared, and shouted loudly enough to ensure his words pierced the cabin walls. The cash offer stood firm. And he, Arthur Sterling, actually knew how to properly care for things of immense value. When the dust of Arthur's departure finally settled on the trail, Henry stood paralyzed in the center of the yard, the brutal sun hammering the top of his head, while a freezing, terrifying shadow swallowed his heart whole. Arthur's venomous words echoed relentlessly in his skull. Beautiful women grow very tired of living in grinding poverty. Was it the truth? The agonizing doubt burrowed into his soul like termites into rotting wood. He turned and stared at his pathetic cabin, at the small patch of flowers, at the crisp curtains. All of it suddenly looked incredibly fragile, like a stiff breeze could blow it all to hell. He had no cash hidden under the mattress. He had no fat prime cattle. He had no gold jewelry to offer her. All he had was the sweat on his back, the strength in his arms, and a patch of cursed dirt that Arthur claimed was utterly worthless, except perhaps for whatever secret water source might be buried deep beneath the rock. Dinner that evening was a suffocatingly silent affair. Henry chewed his food mechanically, tasting absolutely nothing. Catherine missed nothing. She gently asked who the rider was. Henry answered without lifting his eyes from his plate. He told her it was Arthur Sterling. He explained that Arthur owned every blade of grass for miles around. He confessed that Arthur wanted to buy Hidden Springs out from under him. Catherine paused, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. She asked softly if Henry wanted to sell. He finally raised his head and looked directly at her. He saw the warm, golden glow of the kerosene lantern reflected in her dark eyes. He saw the deep lines of worry bracketing her mouth. And for the very first time in his hard life, he was utterly terrified to tell the truth, terrified of looking like a pathetic, delusional failure, clinging to worthless crumbs. He swallowed hard and muttered that he honestly didn't know. He admitted the land was brutal and unforgiving. He suggested that maybe, just maybe, with Arthur's cash in hand, they could scrape together a marginally better life somewhere else. He threw the words out there, testing her, testing the cruelty of fate. Catherine slowly lowered her fork to the table. She carefully wiped her mouth with a cloth napkin, and then, in a voice made of pure, unbending iron, she declared that cash can buy a house, but it can never purchase a home. She told him that when she looked into that rich man's eyes, she saw a ravenous hunger, not for food, but an ugly, hollow obsession with possession. And she swore to him that she would rather bleed over the hard, cracked dirt of hidden springs, where flowers only bloomed because someone loved them enough to water them, than live in luxury on the wealthy soil of a man who only cared about being the master of everything he touched. The breath was knocked completely out of Henry's lungs. She stood up, began clearing the plates, and right before she walked into the kitchen, she reached out and lightly touched his shoulder. It was a fleeting gesture, as soft and quick as a butterfly's wing, but it seared his skin right through the thick cotton of his work shirt. She whispered fiercely that he must not sell. She said Hidden Springs possessed a soul that all the money in Texas couldn't touch. In that single, searing touch, and in those fierce, defiant words, Henry found the absolute certainty he had been desperately searching for. But the crisis was far from averted. Arthur Sterling was not the kind of man who took no for an answer. The following days ushered in a series of sinister omens. A section of barbed wire was inexplicably found slashed in the far pasture. 2 of Henry's milk cows vanished without a trace, only to be discovered days later wandering miles away, emaciated and terrified out of their minds. The creek, which was already running dangerously low, suddenly turned thick and muddy, as if someone had intentionally dammed and contaminated the natural spring further up the ridge, right where the property line bordered Arthur's massive estate. Henry knew exactly what was happening. It was a siege. It was Arthur's cowardly way of screaming, without uttering a single word, that he was going to make their lives an absolute living hell. Henry tried desperately to hide the truth from Catherine. He rode out in the pitch black of night to mend the slashed fences. He hauled water from a creek miles further out, just so she wouldn't have to boil muddy water for tea. But a woman's intuition can see right through solid brick. She saw the bone-deep exhaustion dragging at his shoulders. She saw his work clothes caked in thick red mud. She saw the deepening chasm of worry etched permanently into his forehead. And instead of shrinking back in fear, Catherine charged forward. She began marching out to the fields to help him. Henry fiercely forbade it at first, insisting it was absolutely no place for a lady. She just laughed in his face, grabbed a heavy iron hoe, and told him that hands capable of kneading bread dough were more than capable of breaking dirt. She marched right into the rows beside him, wearing a battered straw hat and her oldest faded dress. She chopped weeds, she planted seeds, she sweat under the merciless sun, and it was right there, buried in the grueling, back-breaking labor, that their love struck a taproot deep into the earth. It wasn't born at a fancy barn dance. It wasn't forged on romantic carriage rides. It was forged in the shared agony of lifting a heavy hoe, in the shared relief of passing a water gourd back and forth, in the shared crushing exhaustion at the end of the day. They would collapse in the meager shade of a twisted mesquite tree to catch their breath. Henry would look over at her, her beautiful face smudged with dirt, her chestnut hair falling out of its pins in a tangled mess, and he genuinely believed she was the most breathtaking creation God had ever bothered to sketch. And she would look right back at him, seeing the undeniable honor, the raw, unyielding strength in his tired, weathered face, and she knew in her bones that this patch of dirt was exactly where she was meant to be. but the siege was tightening like a noose. Late one afternoon, Esther rode up to the cabin at a frantic gallop, her horse foaming at the mouth. She brought catastrophic news. She gasped out that she had heard the men talking down at the general store. Arthur was loudly spreading a vicious rumor that Henry's late father had died owing a massive unpaid gambling debt, and that Arthur was preparing to drag Henry in front of a judge to foreclose on the land if he refused to sell. It was a bald-faced, venomous lie, of course. Henry's father had never gambled a penny in his life. But in those days, the law for a man with deep pockets and the law for a dirt-poor farmer spoke two entirely different languages. Henry felt the solid ground physically vanish beneath his boots, not because of the threat of losing the farm, but because of the crushing humiliation, the absolute agony of being publicly branded a deadbeat, of having his honest father's name dragged through the mud for the whole town to spit on. Arthur was playing the deadliest game he knew. Esther urged him, practically shouting that he had to fight back. She told him he had to ride into town, stand before the county judge, and demand to see the legal proof. Henry slowly turned his head and looked at Catherine, who was standing perfectly still in the doorway, having heard every horrifying word. Her face was deathly pale. A devastating thought ripped through his mind. If I lose this fight, if they take the land, where on God's earth do I take her? If the sheriff throws me out onto the road like a stray dog, what kind of life am I giving her? The paralyzing doubt returned, 100 times more vicious than before. Maybe the only sane choice was to surrender, take the blood money, walk away with his head held up before the public humiliation destroyed them both. He turned back to his sister, his voice hollow, and muttered that he would think on it. Esther wheeled her horse around and rode away, shaking her head in furious, disgusted disbelief. That night, the silence inside the cabin was as fragile as spun glass. One wrong syllable could shatter the entire world. Catherine quietly served the supper. Henry didn't touch a bite. He just stared blankly at his plate, aimlessly dragging his tin coffee mug in slow circles across the wooden table. Finally, he spoke. His voice was a broken rasp. He whispered that maybe Arthur was right after all. He confessed that he, Henry, was acting like a selfish fool. He admitted he was trapping her in a brutal war that wasn't hers to fight. He said he was going to ride out, accept the cash offer, give her half the money so she could buy a train ticket back to Missouri or wherever else she wished to go, and he would just drift on his own way. Catherine stood up from her chair with agonizing slowness. The agonizing screech of the wooden legs dragging across the floorboards sounded like a gunshot in the suffocating silence. She walked deliberately around the table. She stopped dead in front of him. Henry couldn't even summon the courage to lift his eyes to hers. She reached out and firmly grasped his face between her two hands. They were hot hands, calloused from hard labor, the real, unapologetic hands of a frontier woman. She physically forced his head up until his eyes locked onto hers. And then she spoke the words that would irrevocably alter the destiny of Hidden Springs. She told him she hadn't traveled halfway across the country for a patch of dry dirt. She hadn't come for a shingle-roofed cabin either. She told him she came because Esther's letter had sworn that a man lived out here who never, ever quit. She told him that if he sold out of cowardice, he wouldn't just be handing over the deed to the land, he would be auctioning off his very soul. And she declared, with a voice that rang like struck iron, that she, Catherine Barnes, had not crossed half the United States just to watch the man she loved bow his head to a wealthy man's lie. Henry stopped breathing entirely. She had just said, the man she loved. He stared at her, utterly bewildered, his heart hammering violently against his windpipe. She didn't flinch. She held his gaze fiercely, her dark eyes shimmering with unshed tears, but blazing with a ferocious, terrifying strength. He shot up from his chair. It crashed backward onto the floor. They stood chest to chest, their ragged breathing mingling in the space between them. The polite, respectful distance that had always defined their interactions evaporated entirely. Henry grabbed her wrists, her hands still cradling his weathered face. He could feel the frantic, heavy pulse of her heartbeat under his thumbs. He asked, his voice barely a ragged whisper, if she meant it. Catherine smiled, that same world-shifting smile. But this time, a single tear broke free and tracked through the dust on her cheek. She whispered back that she had never once spoken a lie inside his house. Henry pulled her fiercely into his chest. The embrace was clumsy, urgent, and fueled by pure desperation. He buried his face deep into the crook of her neck, inhaling the clean scent of lye soap and orange blossoms. He felt the solid, unyielding reality of her body pressed tightly against his. He felt, for the very first time in his desperately lonely life, that he wasn't trying to hold the entire crushing weight of the world up by himself. They stood locked together in the center of that simple kitchen, the kerosene lantern throwing long, flickering shadows across the mud walls. It wasn't some polished, theatrical romance. It was just a forehead pressed hard against a forehead, calloused hands gripping tight to shoulders, and long, shuddering sighs that finally exhaled years of suffocating isolation. When they finally pulled back just a few inches, there was a completely new fire burning in Henry's eyes. The bone-deep exhaustion was gone. It was replaced by the lethal, focused glare of a man who finally has something worth killing for. He told her he wasn't selling a damn inch. He swore that Arthur Sterling could ride up with the devil himself at his back, and he still wouldn't budge. He said this land belonged to them. Them. The word hung suspended in the air between them, beautiful and indestructible. But the roaring courage found inside the cabin still had to step outside and face the wolves, and the wolves were already circling for the kill. The next morning Henry was up before the dawn, but he didn't walk out to the fields. He walked straight into the dusty back room where he kept his rusted tools. He threw open a cobweb-covered wooden trunk and dug until his hands closed around a heavily yellowed, brittle document covered in the ornate, looping calligraphy of a county clerk who had died decades ago. It was the original deed to the land, handed down by his father. He read every single line, and he discovered a crucial detail his father had never bothered to mention, or perhaps Henry had simply been too young to grasp it. A tiny, legally binding clause regarding the property lines, specifically mentioning an ancient, deep-water spring located up on the high ridge, the exact ridge that bordered Arthur's estate, and the very spring Arthur had been illegally siphoning off for years to water his own massive herds. A cold jolt of adrenaline hit Henry's stomach. If that water legally belonged to hidden springs, the value of his farm didn't just double, it skyrocketed. And what was infinitely worse, Arthur knew it. That was the reason for the desperate threats. That was the reason for the rush. It was never about the dry dirt. It was about the life-giving water that sustained the rich man's empire. Henry shoved the paper into Catherine's hands. She read it quickly, her sharp eyes darting across the faded ink. She looked up at him, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. It was the smile of someone who has just found the key to unlock the tiger's cage. She told him they needed to ride into town. Right that very second. They threw the saddles on the horses. They rode out of the yard together, side by side. Henry looked over at Catherine riding next to him, her spine ramrod straight, her jaw set with absolute resolve, and he thought that never, in all his 34 years on this earth, had he witnessed a more magnificent sight. But as they crested the hill and hit the main road, they saw a massive cloud of red dust churning toward them. A posse of riders was galloping hard in their direction, and leading the pack, sitting tall on his massive black stallion, was Arthur Sterling, and he hadn't brought his men out for a polite chat. "If you are moved by this story of courage and love, leave a like right here and subscribe to the channel, because what is about to happen proves that goodness, when standing shoulder to shoulder, is a force stronger than all the money in the world. Henry hauled back on the reins. Catherine pulled her horse up right beside his. They sat dead center in the middle of the road, 2 against 5. The hot prairie wind howled past them, whipping up the red dirt. The final desperate showdown for Hidden Springs was about to go down right there, baking under the merciless Texas sun, and Henry knew that this time he couldn't take a single step backward, because what stood behind him was no longer just an empty, silent cabin. It was the woman whose smile had quite literally saved his life. 5 armed riders. Arthur Sterling at the point, wearing a fine leather hat, a tailored vest over a crisp linen shirt, his face locked in an expression as immovable as a bank vault door. The other 4 hired guns fanned out behind him in dead silence, arms resting casually over their saddle horns, riding the kind of heavy-muscled horses that men don't use for Sunday strolls. The red dirt road stretched out between the 2 factions like a fresh, bleeding wound across the prairie, silent and brutal beneath the September glare. Henry didn't flinch. His roan horse snorted loudly, stamping a heavy hoof into the dust, sensing the electrical tension radiating from its rider. On his right, Catherine drew a slow, deliberate breath deep into her lungs, refusing to let a single muscle in her face twitch. Her posture remained unyielding, her dark eyes locked dead onto the wealthy rancher, her grip on the leather reins displaying a steady calmness that had nothing to do with fear. Arthur spurred his stallion a few steps closer, halting at a perfectly calculated, intimidating distance. He didn't even bother to tip his hat to the lady. He stared hard at Henry, let his eyes crawl over Catherine, and then shifted his gaze back to Henry with the agonizingly slow arrogance of a man who believes he owns all the time and power in the world. He asked, his voice dripping with false, conversational pleasantry, where they were headed in such an awful hurry. Henry replied flatly that they were heading into town. He stated clearly that it was their own private business. The wealthy rancher slowly shook his head side to side, adopting the condescending posture of a man listening to a toddler babble nonsense. He declared it a remarkably strange coincidence, as he himself was riding into town to finalize some pressing business matters. He casually mentioned that he'd been riding past the Hidden Springs property line early that morning and found the sudden flurry of activity highly suspicious. He added that his ranch hands had spotted a horse tearing out toward the main road right at daybreak. Henry didn't offer a single word of explanation. He just waited. When Arthur realized his calculated silence wasn't going to be filled with nervous chatter, his demeanor hardened. The slick, honeyed tone vanished instantly. He barked that Henry was far too stubborn for his own miserable good. He stated that the cash offer was still officially on the table, but his legendary patience had finally run completely dry. He issued a thinly veiled threat, noting that ancient, poorly kept legal documents have a nasty habit of mysteriously catching fire or disappearing altogether. He added that old, forgotten debts, when suddenly called in by the right people, tend to accrue a shocking amount of interest that ruins a man overnight. It was extortion, pure and simple, wrapped in a velvet glove, the kind of threat a man can never prove in court, Arthur's specialty. But Henry Carter wasn't standing in the same defeated place he had been yesterday. Something fundamental inside his chest had permanently shifted since the night before, since that desperate embrace in the kitchen, since Catherine's ferocious, ironclad words. Since he had finally slept, for the first time in a decade, without the crushing anvil of loneliness sitting on his chest. He slowly reached up and unbuttoned the left side of his shirt, reaching into the inner pocket where he had tucked the deed at daybreak. He felt the brittle, folded paper right over his heart. He slid it out with extreme care, unfolded the yellowed parchment, and held it up between them with both hands. The ancient paper trembled slightly in the hot wind, sweeping off the plains. He announced, his voice carrying clearly over the wind, that he needed to pay a visit to the county clerk's office in Clearwater to verify an official registry. He stated mildly that it was merely a routine procedure, nothing urgent at all. Just a minor, forgotten detail regarding a boundary line that he wanted to ensure was properly filed with the law. Arthur slowly dismounted. He sauntered toward Henry with arrogant, measured strides, his silver spurs jingling sharply with every step. He wordlessly held out his hand, demanding the paper. Henry hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then he handed it over. The 4 hired guns sitting on their horses remained perfectly still, clueless as to what was actually transpiring, but acutely feeling the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure, that terrifying, subtle shift that always precedes the moment when cheap talk ends and bullets start flying. Arthur read. His eyes tracked aggressively across the faded ink with the hyper-focused intensity of a ruthless businessman dissecting a contract, analyzing every single syllable. The rancher was a predator of commerce. He understood legal loopholes better than the judge did. Henry banked his entire gamble on that fact. There was no need for grand speeches or shouting matches. The paper did all the screaming for them. Arthur's face began to subtly warp. It wasn't a sudden, explosive rage. It was a slow, agonizing drain, like water leaking out of a cracked barrel, quiet, insidious, but unstoppable. His dark eyebrows slammed together. His jaw muscles jumped furiously under his skin. A deep, jagged crease carved itself between his eyes. His knuckles turned white where he gripped the fragile parchment. He reached the specific paragraph describing the deep water spring. He stopped dead. He read the line a second time. The silence that crashed down on the dirt road was agonizingly long. It possessed a completely different weight than the lonely silence of the cabin. It was explosive, packed tight with everything that wasn't being screamed aloud. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly. Somewhere out in the endless brush, a mockingbird called out twice and abruptly went quiet. The yellow prairie grass rippled in the baking wind. Arthur finished reading. He meticulously refolded the brittle document with exaggerated robotic care, clearly desperate for a few seconds to organize his reeling thoughts, while his hands performed a mindless task. He shoved the paper back at Henry without making eye contact. Henry slid the deed back into his breast pocket and waited. The wealthy rancher turned his face toward the empty horizon. He stood paralyzed there for a span of time that stretched on infinitely. His 4 hired men shifted uneasily in their saddles, unnerved and highly uncertain, because they had never, in all their years, seen their ruthless boss struck entirely mute. When Arthur finally opened his mouth, his voice was unrecognizable. The polished superiority was gone. It sounded thick and gravelly. He muttered that the deed was an antique. He argued weakly that old handwritten registries were notoriously riddled with clerical errors, that drunken clerks often botched the boundary lines. He declared harshly that he would need his expensive lawyers in Clearwater to tear the document apart. Henry replied, using the immovable iron voice of a man who has absolutely nothing left to lose, that he was personally riding to the county clerk today. And he added that he would be bringing old man Silas Thorn with him, the man who had worked the neighboring land beside Henry's father, and who knew the exact location of every boundary marker decades before Arthur Sterling had even set foot in the territory. The invocation of Silas Thorn's name triggered a visceral reaction in the rancher's face. A dark shadow passed over his eyes. A devastating realization. Silas Thorn was pushing 80 years old and lived in a dilapidated shack a few miles past Hidden Springs, existing so simply he seemed like a ghost from a forgotten century. He was a man who didn't possess 2 nickels to rub together, But he possessed the only currency that actually mattered out here, a flawless photographic memory and a legendary reputation for never uttering a lie in his entire life. He knew exactly who had strung which barbed wire and when, who had bought which rocky acre and for what price, who had dammed a creek and who had dug a well. And when Silas Thorn swore to something in a courtroom, the people of the county treated it as gospel truth. Arthur Sterling stood frozen for a few seconds that were just long enough to scream defeat. And in that precise moment, Henry knew. He knew it with absolute, bone-deep certainty, without needing a judge's gavel or a signed treaty. He knew he had won the war, not with a shootout, not with a massive bankroll, not with intimidation. He had won with the absolute truth, backed by terrifying patience, with the right piece of paper drawn at the exact right second, and a witness whose honor could not be bought. The wealthy rancher took one slow step backward, then another. He climbed back into his expensive saddle, entirely stripped of his previous arrogant swagger. He fumbled slightly with the leather reins, staring blindly down the dusty road. Then he finally turned his head to look at Henry. The emotion warring on his face was impossible to pin down. It wasn't blind, furious hatred. It was the highly specific, bitter cocktail of total defeat, suffocated rage, and buried beneath all of that, perhaps, a microscopic shred of genuine respect that his colossal ego would never allow him to voice. He forced out, in a low growl, that he strongly preferred to settle disputes through the proper legal channels. He stated formally that if the county registry corroborated the absurd claims in the document, he would immediately regularize his use of the spring's water and pay whatever the law demanded. He added stiffly that he was not the kind of man to wage a bloody war over a business transaction that could be resolved with a signature and a check. Henry nodded once. He didn't offer a single word of gloating. Arthur violently yanked his horse around and spurred it hard. His 4 hired guns scrambled to follow, their horses kicking up a massive cloud of blinding red dust that the wind slowly dragged across the prairie until they vanished entirely from sight. Henry sat paralyzed in the saddle, watching the dust cloud slowly settle back onto the road. He felt his thick fingers begin to tremble uncontrollably. It wasn't a delayed reaction to fear. It was the violent release of the agonizing pressure he had been holding inside for years, that terrifying, uncontrollable shaking that only hits a man when he realizes he can finally put the heavy burden down. Catherine nudged her horse a few inches closer. The 2 animals stood flank to flank. Her shoulder was close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from it. She didn't speak. But her quiet, unshakable presence there, sitting tall on a dusty horse in the middle of a baking Texas road, was the most profoundly real thing Henry had felt in a decade. It was the kind of truth that doesn't require a single spoken syllable, that simply exists and demands no justification. He slowly turned his head to look at her. She was staring down the empty road where Arthur had fled, her face a mask of absolute serene composure, almost lost in deep thought. A single bead of sweat tracked down her temple. A few strands of chestnut hair had broken free from her tight knot, and her simple cotton skirt was coated in thick, red dirt. And yet she looked entirely indestructible. She looked like she was rooted to the earth in the way ancient oak trees are, completely unbothered by the howling wind. They rode the rest of the way into town exactly like that, side by side, their horses moving in perfect unison, while the late afternoon sun began to pour a thick, golden, honeyed light all across the sprawling plains. Clearwater was a punishing 2-hour ride from the limits of Stony Ridge. It was a modest frontier town, but it possessed the only institutions that held any real power out there: the county clerk's office, a brick jailhouse, an apothecary who doubled as a cheap lawyer for land disputes, and a bustling livestock market that opened on Thursdays, permanently smelling of sweet tobacco, curing leather, and unwashed bodies. Henry had always despised town life. The deafening clatter of heavy wagon wheels on the uneven cobblestones, the suffocating density of too many people crammed together, the paranoid sensation that every single pair of eyes was judging him. But on this particular day, he rode down the main street with his chin held high. The county clerk's office was housed in a two-story brick building, with a heavy iron plaque bolted to the door and scarred oak floorboards that shrieked loudly under a heavy boot. The inside smelled overwhelmingly of dried ink, stale pipe smoke, and decaying paper, that highly specific perfume of official history, of the desperate human need to lock facts away in books so they can't be stolen. The clerk was a scrawny, nervous man wearing thick, round spectacles, his fingertips permanently stained black with ink. It took him nearly 30 agonizing minutes to drag a ladder across the back wall and hunt through the highest shelves of leather-bound ledgers to locate the correct volume. He huffed and groaned, carrying it to the counter, because the massive book was ancient and brutally heavy, its cracked leather spine peeling and its yellowed pages as brittle as dead autumn leaves. But the moment he carefully cracked it open and began tracking his ink-stained finger down the columns, reading with the reverent focus of a man who understands that a single misspelled word can start a range war, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. The clerk shoved his spectacles further up his sweaty nose. He traced the faded line painfully slowly. Then he jumped to the next column. He pulled a second, smaller ledger from under the counter to cross-reference. He scribbled a frantic series of dates on a scrap of blotter paper with a chewed pencil. He looked up and confirmed it. The deep water spring and the massive swathe of high-ridge land completely surrounding it had been officially surveyed and deeded to the Hidden Springs Tract in the year 1872. The title was spotless. No liens, no formal contests, no transfers of ownership, absolutely nothing to suggest that a single acre had ever legally slipped from the family's hands. The clerk spoke with the grave solemnity of a man delivering a verdict. He stated that this particular era of registry was ironically far more bulletproof than modern filings, because the surveyors back then were meticulous, and the books had somehow survived a courthouse fire. He looked at Henry and said he was an incredibly lucky man to have unearthed the original paper deed, because digging this truth out of the chaotic archives blind would have been nearly impossible. Henry asked a single question. He asked if the clerk could draft and stamp a brand new, legally certified copy of the deed, a modern document that carried the absolute weight of the state law, ready to be shoved in the face of any man who dared challenge him. The clerk nodded vigorously. He said he could, but he warned it would take a few hours to write it up and affix the county seal. They waited outside on the boardwalk, sitting on a weathered wooden bench in the shade of a tin awning. Catherine walked to the corner and bought 2 warm, fresh-baked rolls from an older woman selling them out of a cloth-covered basket. They were steaming hot, smelling of yeast, impossibly soft on the inside. They ate in companionable silence, watching the slow, gritty theatre of the frontier town unfold before them. Women balancing heavy laundry baskets. A barefoot boy sprinting wildly after a squawking chicken that refused to be caught. An old man leaning out of a second-story window, puffing thoughtfully on a corncob pipe, watching the chaos below with the weary patience of a man who has already seen every trick the world has to offer. Catherine spoke softly, telling Henry that her late father used to say that legal deeds were simply the memories we are forced to lend to paper because we are terrified our own minds will eventually fail us. She murmured that her father used to hoard every scrap of legal paper with the exact same desperation he used to hoard firewood for a brutal winter. Henry listened to her voice and thought of his own gruff, silent father, who had locked that priceless deed inside a rusted trunk in a dark room, either entirely oblivious to the wealth it contained, or perhaps being the kind of fiercely stoic man who blindly trusted that the truth always surfaces eventually, believing that right things stay in their right place until the exact moment they are needed. When the clerk finally produced the certified deed, the sun was dropping low, the harsh afternoon glare softening into a rich liquid amber. Henry pulled out his leather coin purse and paid the steep fee, counting the heavy silver coins out slowly, slapping each one onto the counter with the undeniable dignity of a man paying an honest debt, not a beggar asking a favor. The clerk slid the heavy, wax-sealed envelope across the polished wood, the black ink of his signature still slightly damp. He swore it was ironclad. He told Henry that if anyone, no matter how wealthy, ever breathed a word of contest, he only needed to brandish that seal. Henry took the envelope and slid it securely into his inner pocket. The exact same pocket, right over his racing heart. When they pushed through the doors and stepped back out onto the boardwalk, late afternoon was bleeding into early evening. The fading light was spectacular, a generous, molten gold that somehow made even the filthy, manure-stained cobblestones look majestic. The brutal heat had finally broken, leaving a cool breeze in its wake. From an open window somewhere down the alley, the rich, intoxicating aroma of roasting coffee drifted over them, as fierce and welcoming as a warm embrace. Catherine stopped abruptly on the wooden planks. She stood perfectly still, staring at the bulge of the envelope hidden inside Henry's shirt. Her expression was that of a weary traveler who has just witnessed the miraculous, joyful ending to a brutal story she assumed was destined for tragedy. And then she smiled. That smile. But this time, her dark eyes were swimming with a blinding concoction of fierce pride, staggering relief, and an overwhelming, devastating tenderness. It was the absolute most radiant, unfiltered expression he had ever witnessed on a human face. She whispered that her father had been right all along. She said the earth has a long memory, that greedy men can try to pave over it or steal it, but the dirt always remembers who it belongs to. Henry just stared at her. He stared at that smile. He stared at the way the dying sunlight caught the side of her face, illuminating her strong jawline, turning the stray wisp of hair on her forehead to spun gold. He stared at the sheer, unadulterated perfection of a woman standing on the dusty planks of a rough frontier town after surviving a terrifying day, looking completely unbroken, entirely whole. He did something he had never, in his entire life, possessed the courage to do. He reached out and grabbed her hand right there on the public boardwalk, in full view of the bustling street, without giving a single damn who was watching them. Catherine looked down at their tangled fingers, his massive, rough, dirt-stained hand completely engulfing hers, which was much smaller, but possessed a grip like iron. Then she slowly tilted her head back up to meet his eyes. Henry took a deep, shuddering breath. His throat was completely parched, but not from fear. It was the dry terror of a man standing on the absolute edge of a cliff, about to hurl words into the void that he can never, ever take back, and realizing he doesn't want to. He forced the words out. He told her he wasn't a man capable of spinning pretty poetry. He said his father hadn't taught him how, and he hadn't cared to learn, and that he had figured out far too late in life that an inability to speak your heart is a kind of crippling poverty that hurts vastly more than having an empty bank account. He confessed that all he possessed in this world was a patch of unforgiving dirt, arms that ached from labor, and a stubborn honesty that usually ended up costing him dearly. He looked her dead in the eye and warned her that Hidden Springs was never going to be a soft, easy life. The road was brutal, the wind was punishing, and the existence out there was not meant for the weak. But he swore to her, his voice cracking, that if she agreed to stay with him, truly stay, he would dedicate every single remaining breath God granted him to trying to earn that smile on her face. Catherine didn't answer him immediately. Her dark eyes bored intensely into his, deadly serious, analyzing him with that profound, searching gaze she reserved for things of absolute importance. It was as if she was reading the very marrow of his bones. Then she slowly turned her head and looked down the long dirt road leading out of town, the road that vanished into the wild brush, the trail that led back out to the lonely rise, to the tiny timber cabin, to the vibrant flower bed, to the crooked hitching post baking in the front yard. She spoke softly, telling him that on the very first day she arrived at Hidden Springs, the moment she saw the freshly turned soil tucked away in the corner of the yard, she instantly knew. She explained that back in Springfield, where she had grown up, her father held a sacred, unbreakable tradition that she had inherited. Whenever they moved to a new piece of land, before he unloaded a single trunk from the wagon, he would dig a hole and bury a seed in the dirt. He used to say it was his way of formally introducing himself to the earth, of swearing to the land that he was planting roots, not just passing through. She said she had looked at that tiny patch of overturned dirt by the cabin and instantly understood that Henry, without even knowing the tradition existed, had done the exact same thing. He was swearing an oath to the earth, swearing an oath to the future. Henry's voice was nothing but a ragged, tearing rasp when he asked if she was saying what he desperately prayed she was saying. She squeezed his calloused hand so hard it ached. She whispered yes. She said she was staying. If you are moved to tears by this incredible story of resilience and love, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because the most beautiful part is still to come, and you won't want to miss the ending. The long ride back out to the farm felt radically different from anything Henry had experienced in his 34 years of existence. It was the exact same rutted red dirt road, the exact same harsh, unforgiving prairie grass and twisted thorny brush. The exact same rusted barbed wire fences and the exact same elongated purple shadows the dying sun dragged across the scrub. But it felt like riding into a completely alien world. Perhaps it was because, for the first time since he was a boy, he wasn't riding back to a hollow shell. He was riding beside her, heading to her home. The horses walked shoulder to shoulder at a relaxed, ambling pace, as if the beasts themselves sensed that the frantic urgency of the day had finally evaporated. The sun sank lower, igniting the prairie in a violent blaze of orange, which melted into deep crimson, before finally settling into the tranquil, bruised violet that precedes true darkness. Flocks of small birds darted wildly back to the trees, their frantic chirping sounding like a joyful celebration of surviving another brutal day. When Hidden Springs finally appeared around the last bend in the trail, the modest rise and the dark silhouette of the tiny cabin framed against the glowing twilight sky, Henry felt a profound physical sensation violently expand inside his chest. It wasn't the weary resignation of a man arriving at his labor. It was the overwhelming, soul-deep relief of a man finally coming home. They stepped inside, and Catherine immediately struck a match to the kerosene lantern with the fluid, practiced grace of someone who already knows exactly where every object lives in the dark. The wavering golden flame pushed back the shadows, illuminating the spotless kitchen, the embroidered tablecloth, the vibrant flower bed visible through the open window. The yellow petals already folded tight against the night. The cabin smelled of roasted coffee beans, of sun-baked earth slowly releasing its heat, and of wild mint drifting in through the window like a quiet blessing. They sat at the heavy wooden table and talked late into the pitch-black night, sharing a pot of coffee she had reheated over the dying embers in the stove. They finally unleashed the floodgate of words they had suppressed for weeks. She spoke of Missouri, of the wide river that ran near her childhood home, that still haunted her dreams. He spoke of his distant youth at Hidden Springs, back when his parents were still breathing, and the tiny cabin somehow felt like a sprawling mansion. She told him how her father used to sing loudly while he ploughed the fields, swearing that the crops could feel the joy in a man's voice. He confessed that his mother used to bake sweet corn cakes in a heavy clay dish that he still kept hidden on the highest shelf, terrified to ever use it and risk shattering the only piece of her he had left. They laughed. They laughed genuinely, from the gut, the kind of sudden explosive laughter that hits without warning, turning faces bright red and bringing tears to the eyes. They laughed at ridiculous, trivial memories, at foolish mistakes, the specific, incredibly rare kind of laughter that can only exist when a human being feels completely, utterly safe with another soul. And when the silence naturally crept back in between the stories, it was a magnificent silence. It was the heavy, satisfied quiet of two people who no longer felt the terrifying need to fill the empty air just to prove they existed. Henry stared down at the scarred wooden table, tracing the deep gouges in the oak with his thick thumb. He murmured, refusing to look up, that he was going to ride back into Stony Ridge at first light. He said he had a very important conversation to have with Esther. Catherine, her voice dropping to a softer register, gently asked what the conversation was about. He lifted his head. Her dark brown eyes were glowing in the warm lantern light locked onto his, and the corners of her mouth were turned up in a tiny, knowing smile. The look of a woman who already knows the answer but desperately wants to hear him say it out loud. Henry said, his deep voice rock steady and clear, that he was going to ask his sister to help them organize a wedding. Catherine's face transformed into the exact same expression she had worn on the very first day. That smile. The miracle in the dirt yard. The smile that had ripped his cursed world off its hinges, but looking at it now, it was profoundly different. It was anchored deeper. It was intensely real. It carried the undeniable weight of every single grueling day they had survived together. The lantern flame flickered wildly between them, and neither of them spoke another word for the rest of the night. They simply didn't need to. The ensuing weeks injected a frantic, joyous chaos into the usually silent air of Hidden Springs. When Esther heard the news, she let out a shriek so ear-piercing that her husband, working in the shed, dropped a heavy wrench on his foot, convinced someone had been shot, before realizing it was a scream of pure ecstasy. She rode out to the farm 2 days later, a massive bolt of pristine white cotton fabric tucked under her arm, radiating a level of manic energy that a 2-hour ride in the scorching sun couldn't even dent. She seized total dictatorial control over the wedding preparations with the exact same terrifying authority she used to bulldoze through the rest of her life. She decreed the date, the first Saturday in December, predicting the brutal heat would have finally broken. She personally cornered the preacher in Stony Ridge, a man she had known since he was a terrified boy in Sunday school. She drafted the guest list in a tiny leather notebook, furiously scribbling and crossing out names with the grim severity of a general planning a military campaign, which to Esther was exactly what this was. Simultaneously, with a terrifying glare that forbade any argument, she ordered her brother to completely rebuild the rotted front gate before the ceremony, commanded him to paint the living room window frames, and demanded he inspect every single floorboard on the front porch for dry rot. She lectured him loudly that a house hosting a wedding didn't need to look like a millionaire's mansion, but it absolutely had to possess unassailable dignity. Henry rebuilt the gate. He rode into town to buy expensive white paint for the window frames. He crawled under the porch with a heavy iron hammer, violently striking every single plank to test the wood's integrity. He ripped out the rotting boards and replaced them. And then, because a man whose heart is completely invested can never just do the bare minimum, he kept going. He vastly expanded the front porch. He hauled a wagon load of thick, fragrant cedar planks all the way from the lumber yard in Clearwater. He sawed, he planed, he hammered every single joint with a level of obsessive, loving precision he had never applied to any structure in his life. The new porch stretched wide and deep, featuring a massive built-in wooden bench bolted to the far wall, wide enough to comfortably hang two hammocks side by side. He raised the roofline, extending the shingles to provide deep, cooling shade from the punishing noon sun and impenetrable shelter from a driving rain. It took him 2 grueling weeks of back-breaking labor, and when he finally drove the last nail, he walked to the edge of the dirt yard and just stood there staring at it for a very long time. Old man Silas Thorn rode up on the very afternoon the porch was finished. He eased himself down from his saddle with the painful caution that 80 years demands, but his eyes were still as sharp as a hawk's. He stopped leaning on his cane and stared up at the massive, beautiful cedar addition. He murmured that Hidden Springs was finally starting to look like a truly beautiful place. Henry quietly replied that it was finally starting to look like a home. Silas broke into a massive, toothless grin that was pure, unfiltered joy. He told Henry that his late father would be bursting with pride if he could see it. He added that any man willing to bleed into the dirt to plant a good life deserves a comfortable place to sit and watch the harvest. Catherine, meanwhile, worked her hands to the bone over those weeks, moving as if her physical labor was the only way she knew how to express the overwhelming joy in her heart. She spent hours sitting by the open window, meticulously embroidering a massive white tablecloth with intricate blue thread, her needle flashing in the sunlight. She transplanted a thorny rosebush Esther had dragged out from town, carefully bedding it into the edge of her thriving herb garden. She spent her evenings cutting and sewing her own wedding dress from the bolt of white cotton Esther had brought, her precise, flawless stitches proving she had been taught the craft by a master. Beyond the boundaries of the farm, the explosive tale of the ancient deed and the hidden water springs swept through Stony Ridge the way wildfire devours dry brush. Passed in hushed whispers, fragmented pieces, every gossip adding their own dramatic flair to the legend. The town quickly learned that Arthur Sterling had formally surrendered his claim, that a legally binding treaty had been signed in front of the county clerk, and that the arrogant, wealthy cattle baron was now being forced to cut Henry a hefty check every single month just to lease the water rights. There was no bloody shootout in the street, no screaming matches. Arthur was a ruthlessly proud man, but he was fundamentally a businessman, and he fully understood that declaring war against a state-certified deed was declaring war against the Texas Rangers, not a dirt farmer. And fighting the law was an expensive, losing game. The shocking reality of how Henry had handled the crisis, without firing a shot, without throwing a punch, using cold, calculated patience and a piece of paper, earned him a brand new, staggering level of respect in the town. It wasn't the groveling respect people showed to a man with fat pockets. It was the deep, silent reverence shown to a man of unbreakable, lethal character, the kind of respect a man can never buy. The townsfolk, who had spent years staring out toward Hidden Springs with a toxic mix of pity and superstitious dread, began to rapidly change their tune. It didn't happen overnight because public opinion is a stubborn beast. But it shifted slowly, inevitably, like a rising tide that you don't notice until it's already soaking your boots. The wedding took place on a crisp Saturday in December of 1911. The sun was blazing bright from dawn, but a glorious, chilling wind swept down from the high plains, bringing a miraculous cooling relief, as if the harsh Texas weather itself recognized the magnitude of the day and decided to show some rare mercy. The small church in Stony Ridge was a humble, stark building, whitewashed walls, uneven flagstone floors, narrow glass windows, But Esther had spent the entire morning ruthlessly transforming it, blanketing the hard wooden pews in massive bundles of wildflowers she had hacked from the prairie before sunrise, tying them tightly with bright blue ribbons. The earthy, sweet scent of the wild grass, colliding with the heavy smoke of the preacher's incense, created an electric, magical atmosphere that only exists when a room is packed with people who genuinely, desperately want to be there. Henry stood at the front, with old man Silas Thorn standing proudly as his best man. Silas had hobbled down the aisle with agonizing slowness, but beaming a smile so enormous it dwarfed the room, the smile of an ancient man who has survived a lifetime of misery and recognizes a true miracle when he sees one. He claimed his spot in the front row like a decorated general taking the seat of honor, which was precisely what he deserved. Henry stood rigidly before the wooden altar. He wore a blindingly crisp white shirt, dark, heavy trousers, and leather boots he had spent 3 hours polishing by lantern light before dawn. His massive, calloused hands were locked tightly together behind his back. The preacher was droning on through the opening prayers, but Henry couldn't hear a single syllable over the roar of blood in his ears. He stared relentlessly at the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church, watching the bright sunlight bleed through the cracks. When the doors finally swung open and Catherine stepped inside, every single soul in the building collectively stopped breathing. She wore the simple white cotton dress she had stitched herself. No expensive French lace, no imported silk veil. Her chestnut hair was pinned up elegantly, intertwined with a small crown of delicate white flowers she had snapped from her own garden at Hidden Springs just hours ago. Tough, nameless prairie blossoms that lacked the pedigree of expensive roses, but smelled fiercely of the wild earth, the morning dew, and absolute reality. She walked down the aisle with slow, deliberate grace, her spine perfectly straight, her dark eyes looking dead ahead, locking instantly onto his. Henry completely broke. The stoic, unreadable mask he had worn like armor his entire life, the face of a man trained to swallow his agony and bury his joy, shattered into a million pieces. It wasn't a polite, rehearsed smile. It was the helpless, blinding grin of a man who can no longer pretend he isn't the most spectacularly happy bastard on the face of the earth. The kind of smile that rips its way out of the soul and demands no apologies. She reached his side. She stopped. She took one slow look around the tiny church, taking in Esther's frantic floral arrangements, taking in old Silas weeping openly in the front pew. And then she turned her face back to Henry. And she smiled. That smile. The exact same indestructible calm, the exact same silent declaration of a woman who knows she is standing on the exact patch of earth she was born to occupy. The very same smile that had saved his life in the dirt yard when everyone else had expected her to break down and cry. The preacher recited the ancient, heavy vows, the words that possess the terrifying power to bind two souls together through fire and flood. Henry responded with a booming, gravelly voice that didn't shake. Catherine answered in a crystal-clear, ringing voice that didn't waver for a second. Their hands were clamped tightly together over the altar. The late morning sun blasted through the stained glass window, throwing a brilliant, blinding beam of light directly across the uneven stone floor, illuminating their boots as if the heavens themselves were striking the gavel. When the preacher finally yelled out that it was done, that they were bound as husband and wife in the eyes of God and the law, Esther let out a sob so violently loud that a flock of pigeons roosting in the rafters exploded into the air in a terrified panic, the thunderous clapping of their wings making half the congregation jump out of their skin. And then someone burst out laughing. Someone in the back row cackled at the shock. And the laughter spread like a wildfire, leaping from pew to pew until the entire church was shaking with the deafening, joyous roar of a town celebrating two people who had fought through hell to earn their peace. Silas Thorn, sitting in the front row, blew his nose loudly into a filthy handkerchief and didn't offer a single apology to anyone. On the long ride back out to Hidden Springs, officially husband and wife, Henry and Catherine rode side by side through the golden afternoon light that set the vast prairie on fire. Their shadows stretched out incredibly long across the red dirt. The hot wind carried the intoxicating scent of baked clay and crushed wildflowers. Henry turned in his saddle to look at her. He stared at the bruised white flower still clinging to her messy hair, at the fierce, beautiful light burning in her dark eyes, at the sharp profile of the woman who had traveled from the edge of the world and buried herself deeper into his heart than anyone who had been born on that dirt. He cleared his throat and told her he needed to ask her a question. She told him to ask. He asked her, his voice deadly serious, what she had actually seen when she looked at Hidden Springs on that very first day. He asked what possessed her to smile when every other woman had wept in despair. Catherine rode in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves on the hard-packed clay, the whistling wind, and the ancient, heavy breathing of the wild prairie stretching out forever around them. Finally, she answered him. She said she had looked at a house that was completely empty. She said she saw a man who had built every square inch of it with his own bleeding hands without begging for a dime of help, and who had still possessed the profound, heartbreaking decency to scrub a wooden bench clean and pour fresh water into a jug just in case she was thirsty. She told him that an ugly house built by a good heart is just a home waiting to be born. She said that being poor in money and wood has never been true poverty. Real poverty, she whispered fiercely, is the terrifying emptiness that hollows out a person's chest the second they stop believing that life can be beautiful. Henry couldn't speak. The horses kept walking. The prairie kept breathing. After a long time, he managed to choke out that her father must have been a profoundly wise man. She asked him why. He replied that she had looked at that tiny patch of overturned dirt in the corner of his yard and instantly understood the desperate message he was trying to send without even knowing how to speak. He said that buried seed was a blind, desperate promise he hadn't even realized he was making. A promise to the earth, a promise to God, a promise to a ghost he was already waiting for, long before she ever rode down his trail. Catherine turned her face toward him. Her eyes were shining with that highly specific glassy sheen of a woman who refuses to cry but is feeling the weight of the entire universe crashing down on her all at once. She whispered that she knew. She said she had known it from the very first second. When they finally crested the hill and Hidden Springs came into view, the magnificent, sprawling new cedar porch glowing in the twilight, the front yard exploding with vibrant color from her garden, the window frames gleaming white, and the kerosene lantern already burning brightly inside, lit earlier by Esther. Henry swung down from his horse and reached up to help her down. She slid from the saddle. They stood shoulder to shoulder, staring at the cabin. It was still a small house. It would always be small. The porch was massive, but the core was humble. The front yard was still mostly packed red dirt. The crooked hitching post was still jammed into the ground because Henry had violently refused to rip it out, gripped by the stubborn, sentimental loyalty of a man who refuses to erase the scars of where he started. But the place was breathing. It was pulsing with a life completely unrecognizable from the graveyard it used to be. Henry murmured, his voice softer and gentler than she had ever heard it, that she had been absolutely right from the start. He said it wasn't abandonment. It was a beginning. Catherine squeezed his hand tightly, and they walked through the front door together. The years are silent, ruthless thieves. They steal the hours without making a sound, leaving only the heavy substance of existence in their wake. Whatever is brittle and weak, they rip away and destroy. Whatever possesses deep roots, they fortify and turn to iron. Hidden springs prospered, not overnight, and not in a sudden explosion of wealth that anyone could point a finger at. It grew the way an oak tree grows, invisible to the naked eye day by day, until you suddenly look up one morning and realize you don't recognize the massive canopy blocking out the sun. By their third year, fueled by the substantial royalty checks arriving like clockwork from Arthur Sterling's estate, paid promptly by a broken man who wanted absolutely no further entanglement with the law, Henry hired a crew from Stony Ridge and drastically expanded the cabin. Catherine's kitchen demanded more space, and anyone who had ever tasted her cooking fiercely agreed. She approached the stove like a storyteller, armed with infinite patience and a supernatural instinct for flavor. Her simple pot of beans and rice was a holy ritual that required hours of simmering. The massive chicken and dumpling stews she engineered during the bitter winter freezes became the stuff of legend down in the town square, discussed with the reverence normally reserved for scripture. The humble window box exploded into a sprawling oasis. It wasn't the manicured, sterile garden of a wealthy estate. It was the wild, ferocious jungle of a woman who plants whatever she loves and lets the vines dictate the war. There were massive blooms of yellow coreopsis she called prairie suns, which aggressively snapped open at dawn and slammed shut at dusk like clockwork. The thorny rosebush Esther had gifted her took 2 agonizing years to produce a single bud, but when it finally erupted, the crimson blossoms were so thick the sickly sweet perfume drifted all the way down to the cattle pens when the wind blew just right. She cultivated massive patches of medicinal herbs, weeds to boil for a hacking cough, leaves to crush for a raging fever, and fragrant mints that simply existed to make you smile when you brushed your hand through them. The farming operation expanded aggressively, with the water rights legally secured and the cash flow allowing Henry to hire seasonal hands during the brutal harvest months. His cornstalks shot up taller than a man on horseback, and his bean yields tripled. Utilizing a naturally marshy depression Catherine had cleverly identified near the property line during their second year, they even managed to cultivate a small, thriving patch of wet-root crops. They didn't become millionaire barons, but they became undeniably wealthy in food, and to people who had survived by scraping the bottom of a flour barrel, a full pantry is the only luxury that actually matters. The cattle herd multiplied steadily, pacing itself with the carrying capacity of the land and the depth of their pockets. Henry had always possessed a supernatural intuition for livestock. He could read the panic in a steer's eye. He knew a cow was sick 3 days before she showed a single symptom. Catherine threw herself into the muck beside him, driven by her terrifying refusal to be ignorant about anything that kept them alive. She asked 1,000 questions, never gave a damn about ruining her dresses, and within a few seasons she could judge a head of cattle just as ruthlessly as he could. Old Silas Thorn remained a permanent fixture, riding his bony horse up the trail every single week. He would arrive just after dawn, accept a massive plate of Catherine's breakfast with profound, tearful gratitude, and sit on the porch for hours, weaving epic, sprawling tales of the bloody frontier days. He spoke of Native American tribes that had vanished, of ruthless outlaws who had bled out in the dirt, of forgotten towns that had blown away in the wind. Henry listened to the old man with a fierce, respectful intensity he had never possessed in his arrogant youth, absorbing the violent history of the very dirt he was standing on. Esther made Sunday afternoons her undisputed territory. She would arrive in a cloud of dust, always carrying a bribe, a new baking tin, a recipe she had stolen from the preacher's wife, or scandalous town gossip she deemed critical for their survival. She would stay until the sun went down, furiously scrubbing the kitchen counters alongside Catherine, treating the brutal labor as if it were a luxurious vacation, which, in her chaotic mind, it probably was. The bond forged between the two women deepened into something neither of them had ever anticipated. In the beginning, Esther had scrutinized her new sister-in-law with the paranoid, ruthless glare of a guard dog protecting its territory. But then she opened her eyes. She saw a profound, unshakable peace settle over her brother's face that had never existed there before, a tranquility that wasn't born of exhaustion, but of absolute fulfillment. She felt a lightness radiating through the cabin that seemed physically impossible in such a brutal landscape. One sweltering afternoon, while Henry was miles away stringing barbed wire, Esther and Catherine sat at the kitchen table violently shelling peas. The rhythmic snap-pop of the pods was the only sound in the room. Without looking up from her bloody thumbs, Esther muttered, her voice incredibly quiet, that she had deeply distrusted Catherine in the beginning. She confessed that it was dangerously foolish to trust a woman who materializes out of nowhere, with no family name to verify and no history to check, but she quickly added that the paranoia was a flaw in her own cynical soul, not a defect in Catherine's character. Catherine slowly lowered her hands. She looked across the table at the older woman. Esther looked up, her eyes blazing fiercely. She declared that she had been dead wrong. She stated that deep roots have absolutely nothing to do with geography. They are forged entirely out of iron character, and she swore that Catherine possessed roots vastly deeper and stronger than half the cowards who had been born and raised in Stony Ridge. A brilliant, wet sheen instantly covered Catherine's dark eyes, which she made no attempt to hide. She whispered that there was absolutely nothing to forgive. She said that the ferocious love of a sister fiercely protecting her own blood is a holy thing that commands nothing but respect. Esther violently blew her nose into a rag, loudly blaming the dust from the pea pods for irritating her eyes. Catherine politely pretended to believe her, demonstrating the exquisite grace that made her who she was. Stony Ridge completely altered its verdict on Hidden Springs, moving with the glacial, stubborn slowness of people terrified of admitting they were wrong. The farm that had been the ultimate punchline for misery and isolation evolved into the county's monument to sheer, bloody-minded endurance. Men at the general store spoke in hushed, reverent tones about Henry, the lunatic who refused to sell when the devil offered him gold, the man who dug his heels in and built an empire out of dust when everyone else screamed it was impossible. They spoke of Catherine with awe, the mystery woman who rode out to the edge of the abyss and thrived harder than any local girl ever could. And the legend of the smile, the quiet rumor that had started leaking out of the church the day of the wedding, eventually became a story shouted from the rooftops. The epic tale of the woman who refused to weep. The woman who stood in the graveyard where a dozen girls had sobbed and smiled instead. Mothers repeated the story to their daughters when the crops failed, a desperate reminder that the lens through which you view the world dictates what the world becomes. Over the decades, the towering menace of Arthur Sterling slowly eroded into a ghost. They never shook hands and declared a truce. That kind of theatrical garbage wasn't in their blood. But a cold, pragmatic understanding calcified between them. The unspoken treaty of two lethal men who realize life is entirely too short to waste energy staring down the barrel of a gun. At crowded town events, they exchanged stiff, grim nods. Once years later, they even engaged in a brief, brutally honest negotiation over a herd of cattle that resulted in a fair sale. Arthur never possessed the humility to apologize out loud for his extortion, but he never dared cross the boundary line again. The outside world mutated violently. The decades rolled over them. The country marched into a new century. Industrial cities exploded outward like tumors. and the iron tracks of the railroad finally pushed close enough to shatter the local economy. But Hidden Springs remained an anchor. It looked exactly as it always had, just vibrating with infinitely more life. There was a terrifying, majestic beauty in that stubborn permanence, the specific beauty of a place that knows exactly what it is and refuses to apologize for it. 17 grueling years after that blistering July afternoon when a woman stepped off a horse and smiled at a patch of dead dirt, the front porch of Hidden Springs was completely unrecognizable. Not in its architecture. The structure was still rough cedar, but now it was draped in massive canvas hammocks, 2 of them swung side by side, woven by Catherine's own bleeding fingers over the years from thick, indestructible twine. The massive wooden bench Henry had hammered together was blackened and polished to a mirror shine by years of bodies resting on it. Heavy clay pots overflowing with trailing vines hung from the rafters, swaying violently in the prairie wind like silent church bells. And standing alone in the far corner of the yard, defying all logic, was the rotted, crooked hitching post where Henry had tied his horse a lifetime ago. He had refused to rip it out. He would never rip it out. It was late August 1928. The sunlight flooding the porch was that thick, miraculous golden syrup that only pours over the plains in the late afternoon, the kind of light that makes it feel like the sun is intentionally dragging its feet, desperate to soak in the beauty of the prairie before finally dying. The air was thick with the smell of baked clay, a fresh pot of boiling coffee on the iron stove, and the overpowering perfume of the massive orange blossoms blooming wildly beneath the kitchen window. Henry was 51 years old. The hair at his temples had turned to coarse silver wire. His broad forehead was carved into deep, permanent canyons by the merciless sun and the freezing wind. His hands were practically made of stone, scarred and gnarled, yet steady as bedrock. But his eyes, those dark, penetrating eyes, were identical, except they now housed a permanent, blazing fire that hadn't existed in his youth. The unshakable fire of a man who knows, down to his marrow, that he is standing on the exact patch of earth he conquered. Catherine was 44. She maintained the severe, lean physical architecture of a woman who never stops moving. The chestnut hair she had arrived with was now streaked heavily with brilliant ribbons of silver, which she made zero effort to dye or hide, and which Henry genuinely believed was the most aristocratic, breathtaking thing he had ever seen. Her face was a map of brutal sun damage, windburn, and deep laugh lines, every single wrinkle earned in blood, every single scar a testament to a magnificent victory. They were laying in the hammocks, side by side, as the blistering afternoon heat slowly bled out of the air, the ancient prairie surrounding them breathing in that rhythmic, eternal lungful of air that ignores the passage of time. In her hand, she held a glass of ice-cold sweet tea, a luxury she had adopted fiercely after a long-ago train trip. In his hand, the battered, indestructible tin mug of black coffee, a permanent extension of his arm, fueling the relentless engine that fired up before dawn and only shut down when he collapsed. They were totally silent. But it had been almost 2 decades since their silence had felt empty. It was the crushing, dense silence of 2 veterans who don't need to waste breath verifying they survived the war together. It was the profound stillness that only descends when 2 humans have bled enough for each other to know that physical presence is the only language that matters. A hot gust of wind blasted through the yard, whipping the dead leaves into a violent, swirling dust devil. The yellow prairie suns violently nodded their heads. The flowers that faithfully snapped open at dawn and slammed shut at dusk with a militant punctuality that always made Henry chuckle. Esther's ancient rosebush, anchoring the corner, was in full explosive bloom again, leaking a perfume so overwhelmingly sweet you could taste it on the back of your tongue when the wind shifted. Catherine placed her sweaty glass down on the floorboards. She stared out into the yard, her eyes locked onto the exact corner where the dirt had been freshly overturned on that July day in 1911. It was an absolute jungle of color now. A massive, chaotic explosion of flowers that clashed horribly by any wealthy landscaper's standards, but existed in perfect violent harmony because they were planted in pure love. Flowers that died in the freeze and resurrected every single spring, as if they knew they were legally bound to the address. She stared at it in total silence, wearing an expression Henry had memorized down to the millimeter. It was the look of a soul drowning in its own history, swimming through memories so painfully beautiful they ache the chest just to recall them. Henry was staring directly at her, exactly as he had done every single chance he got for 17 years. Because staring at her was a physical addiction his brain had formed long before he had given it permission. He asked, his gravelly voice incredibly soft, rolling out like a slow rumble of distant thunder, if she regretted a single damn thing. Catherine slowly turned her head. The dying August sun hit her in a blazing golden profile, illuminating the silver fire in her hair and casting deep shadows into the laugh lines around her eyes. She answered that there had not been a single, solitary second since her boots hit the dirt at Hidden Springs, where the concept of regret had even crossed her mind. She murmured that sometimes she laid awake terrified by the thought that if her father hadn't died, she never would have been forced into exile, and if she hadn't been exiled, she never would have found this road, and she swore to God she wouldn't trade the agony of that journey for all the gold buried in the earth. Henry stayed quiet for a long time. He took a slow pull of his bitter, lukewarm coffee, swallowing it down like medicine. Then he rumbled that he didn't harbor any regrets either. But he confessed that sometimes, in the dead of the night, his mind drifted back to all those terrified young girls who had stood on his porch and sobbed, and he felt an overwhelmingly bizarre, staggering sense of gratitude toward every single one of them. Because if even one of them had possessed the courage to stay, he never would have been forced to wait for the storm that was her. Catherine stared at him. Her face went through a rapid, involuntary sequence of emotions that Henry worshipped and could never accurately predict. She started out deadly serious, shifted into pure shock, melted into devastating tenderness, and finally shattered into absolute helpless laughter. A roaring, genuine laugh. The laugh that tore out of her chest without permission, making her shoulders shake violently and forcing her eyes shut. The joyous laughter of a woman who has just been handed the most profound, staggering romantic confession in history, delivered in the clumsiest, gruffest way possible by a giant of a man who possessed zero poetry in his soul but accidentally managed to strike the dead center of the target every single time. Henry started laughing too. His laugh was a rare, rumbling earthquake that fought its way up from his boots, but when it finally broke free, it lit up the entire damn county. The laugh that, in the brutal early days, Catherine had genuinely feared she might never hear, and had eventually learned to hoard like diamonds. The thunderous sound of their laughter collided and tangled in the hot air hanging over the porch. The prairie listened. The wind carried it off. The yellow flowers whipped wildly in the breeze, possessing the terrifying, weightless grace of a thing that has no idea how magnificent it is, which is precisely why it is magnificent. The sun plunged toward the horizon, executing the exact same violent dive it had done every day, and would do every day for the rest of time. The blazing orange decayed into a bloody crimson, then faded into the deep, suffocating violet that signals nightfall on the Texas plains, the color of a sky that is gently, carefully bleeding out so as not to cause a panic. Henry let his heavy head roll back against the canvas hammock and stared straight up at the cedar roof he had built with his own 2 hands. He stared at the perfectly joined, sun-baked planks. He stared at the heavy clay pots swaying on iron chains. He stared out at the rotted, crooked hitching post, standing defiant in the twilight. He murmured, staring straight up, that Hidden Springs had turned into a truly beautiful place. Catherine whispered back that Hidden Springs had been breathtaking from the very beginning. She said the only thing that changed was that someone finally arrived who had the eyes to see it. Henry slowly turned his head to look at her. She was smiling. That smile. The exact same miracle from the dirt yard 17 years ago. The identical, indestructible calm. The exact same silent declaration of a woman recognizing her kingdom. Except now, the smile was carved infinitely deeper, scarred by time, carrying the brutal weight of 1,000 wars fought and won. Every drop of sweat, every freezing night, every whispered confession over the kitchen table, every comfortable silence, every hard-won laugh, every desperate grip of a hand in the dark. It was the exact same smile, and it was an entirely different universe. Henry stared at her mouth for a very long, agonizingly quiet time, staring as if he were memorizing it for a test, as if he understood that a man must ferociously guard moments like this, because the universe rarely lets a man experience them twice. Then he spoke, his voice dropping into a register so low it was practically a vibration in the floorboards. No theatrical drama, just the raw, bleeding truth of a man who learned to speak decades too late. Thank God you smiled. Catherine tilted her head, her dark eyes flashing with a silent question. He whispered that when all those other girls had broken down and cried, he was convinced the land was cursed. Then he was convinced he was the monster. Then he blamed a cruel God. But he realized it wasn't any of that. It was just the simple, terrifying fact that none of them were her. She froze. The silence that stretched between them was devastatingly beautiful. Then she slowly extended her arm across the chasm between the two hammocks and opened her hand. Her smaller, calloused fingers slid effortlessly into his massive, scarred fist, locking together with the terrifying, inevitable click of a bank vault slamming shut forever. The sky above them bruised into a deep, crushing purple. The first star punched a tiny hole of light through the dark. Hidden Springs sank into the night exactly as it always did, exhaling the slow, ancient breath of the dying prairie. A cricket fired up a frantic rhythm down in the brush. A lone nighthawk shrieked miles away. The hot wind died down into a ghost of a breeze. And there, on the massive cedar porch that had once been far too narrow to block the rain, two battle-scarred people who had proven to the world that a home is not a building, but a violent, unyielding choice, lay gripping each other's hands in the dark while the night swallowed them whole, because that is the brutal, beautiful truth about real love. It isn't born in expensive ballrooms or forged in pretty, hollow promises. It is born in a barren dirt yard, inside a smile nobody saw coming, rooted in a cheap seed buried in the earth by a man who didn't even realize he was making a promise to the universe. And it violently claws its way down into the dark, spreading like iron roots, silent and indestructible, until one morning you open your eyes and realize you can't even fathom a universe where it doesn't exist.